So how is it that we approach other people? A kind of starting point is that we don't see everybody the same way. We automatically socially categorize people. Like I see very quickly what your age is. I see very quickly what your race is. I see very quickly what your gender is. And I do this like within a tenth of a second. Like it's super fast. And I can categorize people differently, but you know, like we say, don't judge a book by its cover, but that's impossible. Like that actually our brains are engineered to quickly detect what these social categories are. And that's fine, right? That's not problematic in and of itself, but these social categories are associated both explicitly and implicitly with various features. And some of these features may be positive and some of them may be negative. These are the basis of stereotypes. And stereotypes, like social categorization, in themselves are not negative things, right? So stereotypes are beliefs about certain groups of people. And our brains are kind of set up to chunk the world in certain ways. We can't help but use this kind of chunking mechanism. The problem is when these stereotypes are harmful, when they perpetuate further harm to a stigmatized or marginalized group. So a lot of what I started thinking about was how these processes affect how we interpret a social interaction. So I don't approach everybody in the same way. In fact, I kind of like identify some people as part of my in-group as, you know, relevant to a context. Like in some contexts, like other philosophers are part of my in-group. In other contexts, it's parents, right? In particular, parents with small children at home. That's the in-group for a lot of my daily interactions right now. And so like thinking about how we kind of group people in these different ways and how we tend to have more charitable interpretations of people who are part of our in-group. And we sort of see ourselves in them a little bit. And it makes us think like, well, what is the better explanation of their behavior? That really influences how you interpret somebody and how you interact with them. So all of this is kind of like this messy picture of how real world interactions work. And sometimes it is a kind of cynical picture, like, you know, the fact that we can't help but token stereotypes. The fact that we have these biases and sometimes they're difficult to control. The fact that these biases and stereotypes are, in a sense, habits of the mind, right? They're not the sort of thing that you can just kind of delete from your mind very, very quickly. These are things that sort of got me thinking about this kind of social and political dialogue with somebody who is quite different from you. And of course, probably like all 119 participants on this call right now, there's like personal interactions, right? Like where you're trying to talk to somebody who you think like, how could we have gotten to such a different place? Like, how can we start with such shared history and end up in like totally different perspectives? And how do we come together and understand each other's perspectives? Maybe not to change each other's mind. I mean, sometimes that's the goal, of course. But in other cases, it might just be to try to understand how we got to this place. So this is where my research is coming from, the kind of like cognitive science aspect of it. And yeah, okay, that's my intro.
So maybe I'll begin, Shannon. And by the way, for everybody who's listening, Shannon and I are hoping that this could be basically a discussion that we have with each other. We have these discussions in our offices and on the telephone all the time. And we just thought that we could try to share with everybody some of the things that we've been talking about and thinking about. So let me begin, Shannon. You know that my thought is that we have shared values, and I want to talk a little bit about the shared values. at first, when I'm in a class with somebody or sitting down with dinner with somebody, and let's just say one person says they're against affirmative action and someone else says that she's for affirmative action, it immediately seems like our values aren't the same. And then we might move on and talk about abortion. And one of the people is pro-choice, probably the person who's for affirmative action, and one of them is pro-life. And again, it seems like there are some differences, and I don't deny that there are differences. The differences are real. But what I've been thinking about is we can imagine our moral commitments as having certain levels. For example, I might say to you, I'm against affirmative action. So that's one level. And your natural question is going to be, why are you against affirmative action? And I'm going to come up with a more general explanation or a more foundational explanation. I think we start to share a lot at that more general explanation. And it's even likely the case that if I ask you about that explanation, we're going to even get to even a more foundational explanation. What moral philosophers often talk about is a moral theory or a moral theoretic explanation. And I'm convinced that we share a lot at that level, but I don't want to talk about that level tonight. Let me just look at affirmative action and maybe quickly abortion to give you an idea of what I mean. If we look at the arguments for or against affirmative action, if I'm sitting next to somebody in a restaurant, which I wouldn't do in this day and age, but in any event, if I did, and the person said that she was for affirmative action, for example, I know exactly what the argument's going to be, but I'm going to ask her, and she's going to say something like, she's going to essentially articulate what we call the compensatory argument, most likely. And the compensatory argument says something like, a person who has been unjustly denied something or harmed something in the past deserves compensation. Now, this is a moral claim, and it's a claim that we all embrace. If I'm walking down the street or driving down the street and you run into my car and it wasn't my fault, we all agree you should compensate me. If you borrow my computer and you drop the computer in a puddle, presumably you're going to compensate me. So most of us believe that if someone's denied something that they have a right to, they should be compensated. The rest of the compensatory argument for affirmative action is certain groups throughout history have been unjustly denied certain opportunities, whether it's admission to schools or job opportunities. And now we have the argument. If someone's denied something unfairly or unjustly, they should be compensated. We have these groups throughout history who have been denied things unjustly or unfairly, therefore they should be compensated. Now, the point of this is that the principle, the first thing that I stated, that's doing all of the moral work, or most of the moral work, is if somebody is denied something in an unjust or unfair way, they deserve compensation. And whether you are for affirmative action or against affirmative action, Shannon, you embrace that principle. Now, let me quickly look at the other side. The argument against affirmative action is usually referred to as the meritocracy argument. And again, the principle that's doing the moral work is something like people should benefit, or their reward should be based on something like merit. So for example, if I'm teaching a class and I have 5 students who studied really hard and they all get 93s on their exam, and I have 5 students that never came to class and get a 47 on their exam, one thing I could do is pass out the grades based on merit, or what I could do is just throw their names in the hat and say 4 people get a 93, 1 gets a 92, etc. All of us agree that would be absurd. And the reason we all believe that would be absurd is because we do think merit should play a role in terms of how we distribute goods or benefits in society. Now, affirmative action is arguably a violation of the principle of meritocracy. These arguments get really complicated, and I'm oversimplifying the arguments, but for the sake of this discussion, I think that's okay. So let me go back to it. So we basically have this argument which says the principle of meritocracy should govern the distribution of goods and benefits. Affirmative action is a clear violation, or arguably a violation, of the principle of meritocracy, because we might have, depending on the form of affirmative action, two people who at least look even the same, but maybe one seems to have a little more merit than the other. And again, like I say, I'm oversimplifying things, but affirmative action might say something like even one of the parties who might seem to have less merit should get a leg up. Well, if the principle of meritocracy governs, then affirmative action is wrong. But the crucial thing here is that if you're for or against affirmative action, and same with me, if you and I focus on the fact that that's what we disagree on, we're going to think that we don't see eye to eye morally. We're going to think we're different. Where in fact, if we focus on the fact that we both agree on the principle of meritocracy and we both agree on compensation, then it becomes, I think, a really interesting question. And this is where the fun part comes in, because now if I'm truly interested in dialogue, Shannon, I want to hear, why do you put more weight on compensation? And I think you want to hear, why do I put more weight on the meritocracy? Affirmative action is not as divisive as abortion, but abortion works the same way. Just really quickly, I'm just going to look at one side of the abortion issue, and we could talk about it more if we want to. But the standard pro-choice argument is a woman has a right to do what she wants with, in, and to her body. A fetus is inside a woman's body, therefore she has the right to decide whether the fetus should stay in her body. Again, there's different arguments, but the point is, and I've talked to people about this, if I walk up to the most strident pro-lifer and I say to them, the government just passed a law that says you need to donate a kidney to a dying stranger, the most strident pro-lifer is going to say, wait a minute, that's unfair. It's my kidney, it's my body. I should have a right to do what I want with it. So notice that even the most strident pro-lifer embraces the moral principle, the principle that's doing all the moral work in the pro-choice argument. Which again, now what I'm thinking is that oftentimes pro-choicers and pro-lifers think that the people on the other side are moral monsters. Well, how can this person be a moral monster if she actually embraces the same principle that I embrace? I could talk about the pro-life argument, Shannon. I know you know the pro-life argument, but I maintain, and I think you know through conversations with me, that the same thing holds, that in fact, the pro-choicer actually embraces many of the moral claims that the pro-lifer makes. And if we talk about this, we'll realize we're not moral monsters. And now what we want to do is figure out, why do we disagree about the weight that we put on each? Back to our affirmative action. Why do you put more weight on meritocracy? Why do I put more weight on the other? This is going to have to do with our life story and a variety of things. And as I said in my introduction, when I learned this about you, it really is like reading a novel. And I develop empathy for you. And now you and I have a relationship. But the problem is, as you've said to me, it's not so simple. And you and I have talked a lot about barriers to dialogue. We've talked about stereotypes and other things. What do you think? Do you want to talk about stereotypes for a little bit and how this is going to interfere with the ability of people to talk about these issues in a respectful and productive way?
Yeah, maybe I'll circle around to something like stereotypes. So I think it is a real achievement to recognize that there are a set of values that you share in common, and that you're just ranking them differently. And that there are real questions about how you should rank these things. And we all agree that there are super hard cases. And that maybe there are some cases that are easier, and we agree on the easy cases and we disagree on the hard cases. That's a real achievement. Getting to that point, that is getting to the point where you're having this conversation where you trust another person enough to say, like, this is what I think about this hard case. That's difficult. It's difficult to express an opinion that somebody's going to dislike, that they're going to disagree with you, that this is something controversial. Even if you don't think it's controversial, you know the other person thinks that. So kind of having the trust to say, well, this is what I think. Um, and what do you think? Like, not just me kind of, standing on my soapbox and telling everybody what I think, because there are certain people who are amazing at that. Those people also aren't always amazing at listening to another person's perspective and understanding where they're coming from. So that kind of mutual trust, I think, is really difficult to establish sometimes. Now, some cases may be kind of built in. You have the trust not from this conversation. You have the trust from having some kind of shared history, right? So they're a family member or they are a friend, and independent of these kinds of difficult conversations, you establish this kind of mutual trust. Like, you know that at the end, I'm not going to walk away thinking you're a moral monster, and you're not going to walk away thinking I'm a moral monster. The more difficult case is like when you're talking to somebody who you haven't shared 20 years of experience. When you're talking to a colleague or talking to somebody who's, a friend, but not, like a best friend, right? I think what a lot of, talking to my students about this, I think what a lot of people struggle with is like knowing that it'll be a difficult conversation and not wanting to be judged in that conversation. But also, so this is where the stereotypes come in, thinking like, what's the point, right? Like, I'm not going to change this person's mind. They're just going to walk away kind of thinking like, well, now I've heard the other side and I don't agree with it. So I can kind of be done with my homework. I've heard it and now I'm done. I disagree with it and I don't have to consider this anymore.
I think it's worse, Shannon.
Yeah, it could be even
because
worse.
It's not just that it's what's the point. Again, I've told you, I've shared with you, I have a couple of relationships that I've had for many years that are, to say the least, strained. I might actually have some broken relationships that have been destroyed, especially over the course of the last year. And, the adage, never discuss religion or politics, I mean, it comes from somewhere. And it comes from the idea, obviously, that if I talk with my mother-in-law, for example, about Joe Biden or Donald Trump and we don't agree on it, then I'm not going to be invited over for dinner anymore.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a real difficulty. And for me, the kind of takeaway here is that there are some circumstances in which this conversation has some significant barriers. Circumstances in which you don't have established trust, or context in which it's really difficult to kind of establish that trust with this person. So some of the cases I'm thinking of are when you're having these discussions online, when you're having these discussions in a public forum. So think about like somebody who disagrees with you politically, socially, morally, and think about having that conversation, like how you kind of establish in this context with this particular person, some kind of mutual trust. Like, you want them to know that you're listening, you really are listening, and you want to hear what they say, whatever it happens to be, like some kind of openness about this. And the same for them, right? You want to kind of know for sure that they're listening to you. Now, try doing that in front of like 700 other people who are watching and looking for signals of what you think. And are you really on that side? Are you really on this side? Right? There's this phenomenon called code switching, where what you need to do is kind of, you talk to certain people in some ways, right? You use certain language or you kind of express certain views. When I'm talking to philosophers, I talk a certain way. When I'm talking to, like, my husband works in the athletic department. When I'm talking to athletic department folks, I do not talk like I talk to philosophers. It would be horrible. When I'm talking to family members, I don't talk like I talk to philosophy department folks. I sort of talk a certain way in a certain context. I express certain ideas. And not that I'm being inauthentic, but like there's just a kind of like mode of communication. Now, try to establish trust with somebody when you have all these other audiences that you code switch for observing. And I think in these circumstances, it's really difficult to establish the kind of trust that's essential for having these productive dialogues where you triangulate on what your shared values are and your different strategies for ranking them. So I think that's a sort of context where it's really difficult to achieve this.
And even added to what you're saying, it's not just that I don't feel safe or trust, but again, Arlie Hochschild talks about the alarm that goes off. And the alarm that goes off is when I see you, and for example, if I am a Joe Biden supporter and I see you wearing, I don't know, some sort of, well, a MAGA hat, for example, I'm going to be much less forgiving, much less open to you. So it's not just that it's hard for me to find a position in which I feel that I'm safe, but it's important for me to be aware that I'm actually making you not safe, even though I'm going into it with the best of intentions. Again, I've been thinking about this stuff for years, and I see myself at times where the alarm goes off. And what I need to do is learn how to not have the alarm go off. And what I mean, again, is that if my brother walks into the house with a Joe Biden hat and I'm a Donald Trump supporter, I'm going to react very differently. And the alarms just aren't going to go off. But if one of my students walks in, it's going to be different. And someone at the gas station, it's going to be really different. And again, I guess this brings us back to stereotyping.
Yeah, it really does. And I think this is kind of related to something I wanted to talk about, which is like how you kind of go about interacting with somebody who you know, right? So somebody wearing the MAGA hat or somebody wearing the Joe Biden hat, somebody that you know is going to disagree with you on some pretty big issues, right? These aren't superficial issues, right? The fact that somebody's wearing this hat is an indication that they believe it strongly and that they want other people to know. They're kind of broadcasting it for the public in a way. It's not just that they believe this, but they are kind of signaling to everybody, this is the kind of person I am, right? So there's this really interesting distinction that I think it's a bit academic. So sorry about that. But I think it's really helpful in thinking about how to engage with people who disagree with you. It's this distinction by Thi Nguyen between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. So epistemic is just a word in philosophy that means knowledge, or the study of knowledge. So an epistemic bubble is, so somebody's in an epistemic bubble when they don't have access to a different viewpoint. So if you grow up in like a really homogenous culture or like a small town where everybody has roughly the same views, social, political, religious views, then you might in fact be in an epistemic bubble. You've never heard anybody articulate why they believe a different faith, right? Because everybody roughly has the same, broadly speaking, same faith. Or you've never heard a kind of plausible defense of a different political view or a support of a different kind of political candidate. All you know is kind of like what you think somebody might say, or maybe you've heard some kind of like, you're like, oh, wow, that sounds really stupid. I can't believe people believe that. So you're in, so this is a case where somebody's in an epistemic bubble, right? There's a difference between an epistemic bubble where the issue is that you just don't have access to alternative perspectives, and an echo chamber. And an echo chamber, so these are both kind of problematic features of our society because they both reinforce a kind of separation of groups or separation of ideologies or viewpoints. But they work really different and they have really different interventions. So epistemic bubble is a problem of access, right? You don't have access to different kinds of viewpoints. An echo chamber is one where it's sort of insular in a way where it's not that you don't have access. I mean, there is a kind of like circling the wagons and staying kind of interior, but it's that you actively distrust other voices. And so you have a kind of mechanism for dealing with a chance encounter with somebody who disagrees with you. You're like, oh, they're this kind of folk, right? They have, kind of name or a label. Like, well, of course they believe that, they subscribe to this view. So it's like you don't entertain what they're saying. You don't believe it. You don't trust it, right? There's this kind of like engineered lack of trust for people who disagree with you. And so just to kind of compare these, an epistemic bubble is one where it's easy to pop in a sense, right? Like you just go talk to somebody and give them a reasonable defense of a view that they've never heard a reasonable defense of. An echo chamber isn't, right? So somebody who's in the midst of an echo chamber, you can bring them all the facts that you want and it doesn't matter, right? Because they have tools for doubting those, so-called facts, right? Now, of course, this is a continuum, right? Like on the one hand, there's, people who've never really heard any plausible defense of a view. And there's some people who've heard them maybe, but, maybe not much, or, they haven't really thought about them. And on the echo chamber side, right, there's, trust is a kind of graded continuum. So people can have some suspicions, and then they have this kind of like active working distrust of others. And so when we're thinking about engaging with other people, talking to people who we really disagree with, it's kind of helpful to understand, do they lack access to a plausible defense? Is it that if I articulate this view, it will kind of help them see something they've never seen before? Or is it that like, I'm just going to be wasting my breath because they have a whole system to discount like all the evidence that I could bring to bear on this discussion? These are really different. You can sort of pop an epistemic bubble just by talking to somebody, but like, in a sense, an echo chamber is not the sort of thing that you can just pop and bring facts to. So I think when we're discussing like how these difficult conversations might go, one of the things we need to think about is whether we're engaging with somebody who is on this spectrum. And if we are, what is our goal? Is our goal to change their mind? Is our goal to just show them a different perspective? Is our goal to kind of fix a relationship problem? In a sense, like, I don't understand how you could believe this, and it kind of undermines my faith in this relationship. Right? These are really different sorts of goals.
And finally, there's this one goal that you didn't mention, which is crucial. And I know it's something that you and I have talked to, or is my goal just to understand you, right? And this gets very complicated, because if I want to, it's easy for me to understand Shannon Spaulding and probably all of my colleagues. We share enough. But I do think that the issue comes if I want to understand somebody whose views really are very different from mine, and education is very different from mine. Am I going to get angry? Am I going to get frustrated? Am I going to feel like I wasted my time? And can that be mitigated if my goal is something very different, like you were mentioning, different from trying to convince them that A or B is right, maybe even different from trying to pop their epistemic bubble, but maybe understand why they're in that epistemic bubble or find a need for this epistemic bubble. Again, I heard this interview again with Hochstein, who has influenced me a lot. And she was saying when she spent 5 years in Louisiana, by the way. She's a Berkeley professor. She spent 5 years in Louisiana trying to understand the Tea Party. And she said she met this woman, and the woman said, I love to hear Rush Limbaugh talk about the feminazis. And again, this is a liberal, by the way, from Berkeley. And she hears this. And again, I have to say, her response was amazing. She thought, I wonder why she talks this way. And she looked at the woman and she said something like, you know, I'm curious why you think this. Maybe we can go have tea. And the woman said, I love tea. And at that point in time, she said, we found something in common. We found something in common really quickly. And after that, everything was so much easier.
What is everything?
Oh, dialogue. For her, again, dialogue. For her, dialogue was primarily learning about the other side. That's what her goal was. She didn't go down to Louisiana to try to convince people that they were voting for the wrong person. She thought they were. She basically thought that, well, I don't want, it'll take too much time, but she thought that the Tea Party people, actually in the middle of the country especially, were voting for the wrong side. And she couldn't really understand why they're voting for the wrong side, because she knew that it couldn't be the case that all these people were stupid. She knew these people couldn't all be liars. She knew that they couldn't all be hoodwinked. So something was actually going on there. And she went down there again with the idea of trying to figure out what was going on there. And the way she did it was by finding that common ground rather than being upset when somebody used the word feminazi.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting, I mean, it's like, this is her way of kind of establishing the trust, of establishing a kind of, in a way, an in-group, right? Like a kind of small, temporary, contingent in-group.
And empathy, I think, right? I think, I mean, it's similar, right? So if you and I have shared character, something that we share, I can immediately start to develop empathy with you. And once I develop empathy with you, then of course, the alarm isn't going to go off as quickly as it would have beforehand.
Yeah, it's fragile though.
Oh,
right? So think about how these interactions go, like in real time, right? Like, you know, you think like, okay, I'm with you, and then that alarm goes off, and you say something, you're like, oh, ah, like it's difficult to like maintain it. In part because like when we're having these conversations, they're not just ideas, right? They're not just like, oh, you disagree with that idea. It's like a conviction of yours, right? Like there's somebody who is saying like, no, I have this really deep conviction that I, the listener, find, you know, really difficult to kind of empathize with, like that conviction. So I think empathy is really fragile, and it's one of these things that is very subject to our stereotypes and our biases. So empathy is great to the extent that, you know, we can kind of achieve that. But it is really difficult to maintain consistently.
and what makes it even more frustrating is that you would think, it just seems to be common sense to me, that if I know about echo chambers and I know about epistemic bubbles, and I know that I'm supposed to have empathy with others, that in and of itself would mitigate some of the walls that are built through stereotypes and other things, because I'm aware of it and I don't want it to happen.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what I realize is that sometimes I've actually heard that it's the opposite. We actually were involved in a hiring decision together, you know, and one thing that I remember reading is that if you say to people, and they actually agree with you, we want to, for example, focus on diversity in this hire, that oftentimes 2 or 3 weeks later, people that are totally committed to that, but have been told to be careful, not to have implicit biases and other things, they are actually more biased. And again, it's unconscious and something that they would hope they weren't that way.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulty of these things, that just knowing about it doesn't actually help you much. So if we come back to the idea of these biases or this kind of pattern of thinking as being a habit, so just to kind of think about like the smoking as a habit, right? Suppose like you decide finally the smoking is bad for me, I really ought to stop smoking, and you make the decision. That doesn't help you quit smoking. right? You actually need some strategies, some specific strategies, right? Just knowing that it's a problem doesn't actually fix the cravings that you have, right? It doesn't kind of help you deal with those in a consistent way. And it doesn't help you deal with the fact that you're going to fall off the wagon, and you're going to, you might start smoking again, and you might need another strategy to get back on the wagon, right? To get clean again. And the same is true for these stereotypes and biases, right? You need strategies to deal with them, and you need a way of kind of understanding that, you are going to have those moments where you just have a complete and utter lack of empathy for somebody you disagree with. And you're going to have those moments where you might, not in a way that you're proud, but you might sort of wish ill on somebody who you disagree with. But kind of like remembering those strategies to kind of bring you back to your commitments to be the kind of person who listens and understands and empathizes, right? These are the sorts of things you need, not just the knowledge that,
Right.
that this is.
And I see that Dan wants to ask questions, but really quickly, just to add on to what you say, I oftentimes try to think of it as a process, right? As opposed to a bunch of discrete actions. Rather, this is a really long process. In the same way that it's a long process for me to develop a complex, deep relationship with somebody. And as you said, during this process, if I keep focusing on the goal, I'm really going to fall off. But if instead I focus on the process and realize that sometimes I'm going to go off the track, but I want to get back to the process, I think we have a better chance of communicating in a non-superficial, respectful, productive manner. So I see in the chat that Dan Trippett wrote, I'll start asking your questions now.
We've got several really good ones. Sean writes, how do you feel that the internet slash social media has affected the issue? I find that it allows more people to seek out information that confirms their own opinions and create their own echo chambers.
You want to go first, Shannon? This is
Yeah.
really up your alley.
Yeah, I know Scott's not on social media, so he doesn't know. He still reads the newspaper. Yeah, so I think there are some related problems here, several related problems. One is that you lack a lot of the kind of cues from ordinary social interaction, like you don't hear tone of voice, you don't hear or you don't see facial cues, like you don't get when somebody's joking. And that's, a difficulty of kind of communicating in that environment in general, but especially when you're, communicating about sensitive topics. A second concern is that it's just easier to stereotype in that context, right? It's just easier to put people into their boxes. Like this is that all I have to go on in some cases is just your profile picture and the things that's like the actual words that you're writing in response to what I'm writing. And so it's, easier to essentialize somebody in terms of a kind of certain social political viewpoint. And so I think it's really difficult to have productive conversations in that way. There was some evidence recently, gosh, I wish I knew where this was published. Maybe some folks who are listening saw this study as well, that though it is the case that we tend to, have people kind of in our social media circles who resemble us socially, politically, et cetera, those who have more diverse social political circles in their social media, right? So your friends, acquaintances, whatever, followers, I'm not sure, are people who have different viewpoints on things actually respond to challenges to their views in a much more kind of reasonable fashion, right? They'll kind of consider the idea that they may be false or they got something wrong. Whereas those whose social media circles are much more homogenous tend not to do that as much. So I think there is something to the kind of selective culling of your social media circles and what's left and the viewpoints that you're seeing on a, every day, or for our students, like every 7 minutes when you log on to social media, the viewpoints that you get are kind of like all the same, all the same, all the same. So it kind of like have this kind of, in a sense, like an engineered epistemic bubble.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's the case that whether it's social media or however we get our information, as you said, I don't do social media, but it would be really easy for me to, and I used to actually do this, I'm trying to change now, but it would be really easy for me outside of social media and maybe even natural to focus on 4 or 5 websites. I read all 4 or 5 every day. Look how informed I am. I'm reading this newspaper and this newspaper, and I'm reading a newspaper from Washington State and 2 blogs, and I'm a really informed person. But of course, in reality, what I'm doing is reading the same view, using different words on each one of them. So one thing is the issue of getting the information, but then there's the issue of dialogue, the stuff that we see underneath these articles. That's the sort of thing that I think we really, if we want any sort of serious dialogue, just have to stay away from. Earlier on, we were talking a little bit about what's the right place to engage in political dialogue. Where do we feel safe? It might actually be really safe for me to write something anonymously at the bottom of a newspaper article. But in that case, I'm really not trying to engage in dialogue. I'm not trying to develop empathy. I'm not sure what my motivation would be, but that's certainly the wrong place to do it.
Yeah, I agree.
So also on the topic of dialogue, we have another question that says, is there a limit to what dialogue can accomplish? I do think that many of the moral premises are shared or are shared to some degree, but I wonder what's possible beyond that point. I think most of what's shared stems from compassion for human beings, but then the dividing line is elsewhere.
I think this kind of comes back to the question of what the point of the dialogue is. Is the point to change somebody's mind? Is the point to establish a relationship or kind of repair a relationship, or, like figure out like how somebody came to this view, or to explain yourself so that you feel like you're being misunderstood. The limits are different depending on what your goals are, I think. I think establishing a relationship or kind of like repairing or improving a relationship, the goals maybe are kind of a bit further out. Changing people's minds is really different. It's very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of factors at play in changing somebody's mind. I mean, even if somebody's not in an echo chamber or they're not in an epistemic bubble, there's still all sorts of ordinary psychological processes that make it so that we seek out the kind of information that confirms our views, and we are kind of inclined to dismiss as noise or dismiss as kind of irrelevant stuff that disconfirms our views. So we have all sorts of psychological mechanisms at play that kind of reinforce our own views that make it difficult to change other people's minds.
And also, I would say that the dialogue, you might think of it as having separate segments. So it might be the case, in fact, I think it probably would be the case, that if I engage in dialogue with a stranger, for me to think, or for me even to desire to change somebody's mind is, A, I think it's ridiculous, and B, I think it might be missing the point. At first, really what I do want to do is establish a relationship with another person, learn about another person. Like I said, I do think it's like the first chapter of a novel, for example. But I would also say that as this relationship deepens, as I get to know this person and this person gets to know me, then the dialogue really might change. And in fact, arguably, if I have a deep relationship with you and I care about you deeply, I think that might be the situation in which I'm most concerned with trying to convince you that you have the wrong viewpoint. This is kind of odd because you might think, oh, if you have a really deep relationship with somebody, what, that's just not at play. But I would actually say that if I have a deep relationship with you, for example, and you hold a viewpoint, especially a viewpoint that I might think is offensive to some other people or repugnant, or maybe just doesn't work for empirical reasons, because we have a deep relationship, I'm actually more concerned in this instance with trying to change your mind or at least get you to see the other side. I actually think I'm doing you a favor.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just personally, I think the ones where I have a relationship with somebody who disagrees with me, there may not be the ones that I actively kind of work toward changing their minds, but it's one where the difference in seemingly values or ranking values is the one that's most disturbing to me, even if I don't go to work to change their minds.
So we're getting several questions and comments about confirmation bias and whether or not people, when they disagree, are they really looking at evidence, or are they just kind of trying to attack and destroy the other side? And then we have a question here that I wanted to share specifically to Dr. Spaulding. It says, question, when Shannon is talking about having empathy, what does that really mean in regards to the dialogue? In other words, both speakers, if I'm of a political view, how should I use empathy towards someone whom I believe can cause harm with their political views and the way they vote, regardless of whether I'm right or wrong? Just a clarification on the better way to empathize with someone of a different view.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So there's a couple things in here that I know we're running a little low on time, but there's a couple things that are really interesting here. One is what it means to have empathy and a dialogue. And in this case, I don't necessarily mean like you share their pain or you share their kind of joy. Is that you kind of, in a sense, can like adopt their perspective. Like it's not yours, but like you can kind of see where if you were in that view, in that perspective, like how you would come to that kind of conclusion. So that's what I mean by empathy and these kinds of dialogues. It's kind of like a perspective taking, which is sometimes called in psychology. One of the things that I'm interested in, and then we're not going to have a ton of time to talk about, is like when to like not do this, when it's not healthy to engage in this kind of dialogue, when it's better for you to just say like, I think I'm being harmed by, and like not like, somebody's hurting you like physically, but like I'm not going to entertain perspective taking that dehumanizes me or dehumanizes people around me. I think like that's a kind of dividing line here, like where it's legitimate to not want to understand how somebody could have a view that dehumanizes you. I don't know how to draw all the lines here, but I think that's a really interesting point, and it may be different for individuals and in different context.
And that question actually comes from a former student of mine. And we actually do share a bunch of fundamental moral beliefs, but vote very differently. And I think that if he does look at our own relationship, we take so much value out of the relationship. And we actually do talk about these issues and we argue about these issues. But I don't think that either of us would use the empathy with an attempt. I don't even know if I'm using the word right to say use the empathy in an attempt to change the other person. I really do think that at this point in time, the empathy almost is there in order to deepen the relationship, because there are times when he hears me say things and I hear him say things and we disagree strongly. But then we remember all these conversations we have and everything that we've shared. And that's where the empathy comes in, to the point that I might even be able to say something like, and I think you were suggesting this, Shannon, if I had walked in Parna Mohana's shoes and had the same parents that Parna Mohana had and that sort of thing, I might actually believe what he believes. And I think that's really helpful for me, not only in terms of understanding you, but maybe in terms of us trying to arrive at some sort of shared values, or not quite shared values. What would I say? Arrive at certain things, I guess, that we can agree upon when we're talking about any of the issues.
Yeah, and even if you don't think that you would have the same views if you were to walk in his shoes, that you can see the path, that matters. Right?
Yes,
See how we got there. That matters.
because it makes sense to me. And again, I think even that reinforces empathy, by the way, right?
Right.
If it makes sense to me, then in fact, we share something else in common, which then I think leads to deeper empathy.
Yeah. And importantly, it might not lead to changing minds though.
No,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that much leads to changing minds. I mean, facts do matter in some cases, but I think establishing that trust is important, even if it doesn't lead to changed minds, because it humanizes somebody who really disagrees with you, right? Like they're not all moral monsters. I'm not a moral monster, I promise.
and this might be just, again, ivory tower thinking, but I'm believing more and more that if we focus on the relationship and really focus on what I think in many instances is beautiful about someone different. Again, Shannon, when someone comes in my office and articulates viewpoints that I really find offensive, I really do want to say, get out. But I've noticed that when I read a novel where someone's articulating those viewpoints, I want to read more and more and more. And somehow for me, my goal is to try to interact with others who have these viewpoints that I do find problematic. I don't want to talk to them anymore. I want to have the attitude that I have when I read the novel and say, there's something interesting here. There's something I can learn here. And it just so happens that a consequence of this, a happy consequence of this, is that we might actually be able then to impact each other's thinking about something. But that's not the goal.
All right, you all. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to play moderator now at 7 o'clock. We still have some great questions that we should address, but
so can I just say, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if people want to ask those questions more aggressively. But everybody else should feel free to log off if they would like to.
Thank you all so much for joining us. If you do want to stick around, we'll keep the Zoom going and keep the discussion going. So thank you all very much. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Dr. Spaulding.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thanks. I was getting worried that I would be a Chris.
I mean, Scott, I didn't even get to insult you. Oh my gosh.
I've just got a few minutes, but we can look at these. As you know, I'm about to get in the car and
yeah. I really like this last question about, sort of a difference in
I do too.
How that affects the dialogue.
Oh, which one is that one? Sorry, I can't see.
Power.
It says, beyond any ideological divide in a given conversation or debate, how do we account for imbalances of power among participants? For example, in a difference of belief and opinion position between a faculty member and a student. And I'd ask my students some questions about this this topic too. And I saw a lot of students are afraid to share their beliefs with their parents, and their parents are kind of more powerful than they are. And what you were saying earlier, Dr. Spaulding, about this sort of chunking phenomenon where you just can't help but stereotype people. They're worried that their parents will sort of put them in another category. Like they're not worried so much about arguing about the issues. They're worried about their parents seeing them in a different light.
Yeah, I can totally see how that would be. And with parents, it's also, I think, much more complex than it is with like a professor, right? Like if a professor thinks like, oh, I can't believe this kid thinks that, you think like, okay, well, I'm going to have like, I don't know how many professors, like 72 professors in my college career. Like so one of them thinks that my view is not well-founded. But you get like 2 parents usually. And they know you for a lot longer. So I can see how that fear would be much more potent. I don't know. I mean, I guess I think like in those power dynamics, it is a matter of establishing trust as well. Like trust that you will treat me as an autonomous adult who can make her own decisions, and that you will respect that I have come to these views on the basis of a lot of thought. It's not reactionary. And if you don't have that kind of basic level of trust, because they won't, or because you fear that they won't, then I think that that's really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue for Habermas, right? One of the things that Habermas talks about when he talks about arriving at a consensus is that essentially everybody at the table has to agree. So again, this is an ideal for sure. But a second thing that Habermas talks about, it's not just that everybody at the table agrees, but that there is no power. He actually talks about the only power that's permitted is the compulsionless compulsion of rationality. So the only power that's actually allowed into the room is rationality. And finally, Habermas talks about people have to have the right attitude going into the dialogue. And I think that's crucial, is that if I'm engaging in dialogue with you and I have any idea that you're playing games, that you're not being completely honest, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Still got questions coming in, if you guys are willing to answer one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more for me. Shannon, you can keep on.
I'm trying to avoid doing bedtime for a 2 and a 4-year-old. So like, bring the question.
I've got a 4-hour drive ahead of me.
Your name is referenced in here. So it says, it seems that yes, on a personal level, engaging in this empathetic dialogue is productive in many ways. However, taken to a societal level, how does this practically play out? Very clearly, certain parties do not in practice share those fundamental moral values Dr. Gelfand referenced. Do you believe that focusing on this relationship is actually tenable in today's environment when basic facts, for instance, climate change, are being questioned?
I was thinking about this this morning, actually, the kind of difference in having these discussions at a kind of institutional level and having these discussions at a personal level. And the difficulties of having them at an institutional level are really different. So it's not just the individual level problem scaled up. It's like you don't trust institutions, right? You don't trust that for example, your government is doing what it's supposed to, that your government is reporting the facts and only the facts, right? There is this interesting story on NPR, on Planet Money on my way over here. And it was about like, who trusts the numbers coming out of like the economic numbers coming out of the administration now compared to exactly 4 years ago. And like people don't trust, like the people who didn't trust it 4 years ago do trust it now. The people who don't trust it now didn't, vice versa. And I think that's not an issue of me trusting an individual, though some people can make a certain figurehead as a proxy for that. It's trusting that the institutions are resilient despite who's in the office. And that I think we don't have. We don't have that trust in institutions. So they're really different problems, and it's a really important point.
Hello, Michael Jamaluddin. Do you remember Jamaluddin, Shannon?
I do.
Okay, that was Michael's question.
I saw.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, again, this is something that I've been thinking about, especially today, for example, when we see the hearings, the Supreme Court nominee hearings. And if that's what you're talking about, I tend to think, at least right now, we're not ready to have these sorts of conversations at that level. It might be the case that over time, and this might be something that comes bottom up. I'm not really sure. Maybe it can go in both directions, but I think that at this point in time, so many of the conversations that we have, at least in the political institutions, they're certainly not geared towards this sort of discussion. In fact, they're somewhat geared towards winner take all. And once winner take all comes into play, then it does seem like a lot of the constraints on dialogue that I would expect to have with an individual, those all just seem to go out the window. And I do think, Michael, that it is much more complicated in this environment when we can't even agree on the basic facts. I remember it used to be the case that if you said to me something like an airliner was shot down in 1984 on such and such, that we could all go to the same place and we would all agree that we could believe that. Now it's the case that we can't even do that anymore. And sometimes, truthfully, I think if we can't agree on basic facts, I have to admit, I wonder if productive dialogue is even possible at that point in time.
Yeah. I just want to highlight that it is a continuum. And, people can kind of represent different spots along the continuum. Someone I disagree with might kind of have some suspicion that maybe that's, these facts are kind of like shaped by, motivations that are, not kind of trustworthy. Or it may be the case that they actively distrust it, right? They're kind of like spreading false information. And I think the conversations can be more productive when you're further away from the ends of the continuum.
Yeah, I mean, I had this experience recently, Shannon, where it was just like this, but this was more with an individual, and the individual told me something about wearing masks and a danger associated with wearing masks. And I will admit, my first thought was, I'm going to go online, I'm going to find information that demonstrates that what this person says is false, and then I'm going to win. And I know, again, from talking to you and talking to others, that it might actually be the case that if I come up with really good information and win, that 6 weeks from now, that person's actually going to believe more deeply than she believed beforehand, before seeing the evidence that I placed there. But again, it maybe probably because we were having this chat tonight, I thought to myself, I'm not going to get involved in that.
Right.
I don't know what's, so basically this person continues to have that viewpoint. Maybe that's the best I could hope for, but on the other hand, we'll talk more and maybe eventually that'll come up again at the right time. Yeah. Again, it's a process.
Yeah.
And with that, I am checking out. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this. Shannon, as always, you and I will continue to continue these conversations, but this has been a lot of fun.
Yes, of course. Bye, Scott. Safe drive.
Bye, all.
Are we going to keep going, or should we?
If there are any, like Joseph's little celebration sign. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. But if people are kind of done, that is fine.
Yeah, I think they're dropping out.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and Dr. Spaulding, and everybody who joined us, and everybody who asked a question. We really appreciate it. You guys have a great night.
Okay. Goodbye. Go watch the debate. Or a town hall. Sorry.
See you, everybody.